information. But again, we welcome you to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're continuing to go through that. And so tonight we are going to tackle the Beatitudes, which is Matthew 5, 1 through 12, and fulfilling the law, which kind of is that famous salt and light passage that many of you have probably heard before, which is Matthew 5, 13 through 20. But we're going to start with kind of an opening question before we even get to the scripture. So you can unmute yourself and talk if you have an answer to this. But what enemies do you know of, whether individuals or groups, who have reconciled? Can you think of anybody? And if you can't think of any instances of groups or individuals who were enemies once and have reconciled, why do you think reconciliation is rare, or do you think it's rare? So that's kind of our question. Do you know of anybody who's reconciled or groups of people who have reconciled? And if you can't think of instances, why do you think reconciliation is rare?
This is Peter. Of recent history, we have the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland, who have reconciled and in fact want to keep a borderless border, or at least customsless border, to allow things to happen within their communities.
Right. That's a good example. Other examples? It's a hard question. It's hard to think of. I think of the church splits we've had. That's what came to my mind when I just read it, and I hadn't even thought about that ahead of time. Is like 1983, the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches combined, and that split had happened at the Civil War. So that was a long time of being a separate denominations and coming together as one. And if you look at Presbyterian history, it's split, back together, split, back together. There was old side, new side, old light, new light. That's a history lesson for another day. Any other examples?
Adam, my dad and his brother had a disagreement at one point and really didn't speak to each other for about 3 or 4 years. But then when their mom passed away, they reconciled.
All right. It's a great example. So sometimes tragedy and crisis brings folks together, or necessity. Other examples? What about, why do you think reconciliation is rare? Any thoughts about that?
We get tripped up over our own ego.
Right. We like to be right. We don't like to admit fault. So we especially the world we live in today is so polarized politically, theologically. And we like to take sides and build walls and fences, right? Other thoughts? Us versus them.
Well, it might mean, admitting that we were perhaps not always right. So again, it comes down to the ego.
Right.
And also it comes down to compromise. We have to to reconcile, there sort of has to be a compromise in some ways.
Right. So that kind of may become a peacemaker, which is a hard thing to do, which we're going to talk about tonight. So, all right. So I'm going to mute all of you again. You can unmute yourself because I'm going to share the screen and eventually ask somebody to read scripture. So when I do that, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. Would somebody be willing to read this passage, Matthew 5, 1 through 12? This is the Beatitudes.
I would.
Thanks.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the hillside and sat down. His disciples came to him. He took a deep breath and began his teaching. Blessings on the poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is yours. Blessing on the mourners. You are going to be comforted. Blessings on the meek. You are going to inherit the earth. Blessings on people who hunger and thirst for justice. You are going to be satisfied.
Keep going.
Go ahead.
I said keep going.
Blessings on the merciful. You will receive mercy yourselves. Blessings on the pure in heart. You will see God. Blessings on the peacemakers. You will be called children of God. Blessings on people who are persecuted because of God's way. The kingdom of heaven belongs to you. Blessings on you when people slander you and persecute you and say all kinds of wicked things about you falsely because of me. Celebrate and rejoice. There's a great reward for you in heaven. And that's how they persecuted the prophets who went before you.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I wanted to show, I'm going to stop this for a second because I realized I didn't click the right button. And my mom we were talking about this the other day. I have to share computer sound when I'm sharing here. This is the, we did the Bible, I think I'm trying to remember what he's called. He's the guy who does he drives around the Holy Land. We saw the boat last week. So I wanted you to just see the location of the Beatitudes. And I was actually there when I was 13 with my mom, who's on this Zoom call. And this little short video has that. It also has a different kind of translation of the Beatitudes. So hopefully you guys can hear this. And
so here on a mountainside, not far from Capernaum, in the midst of a crowd of people, Jesus starts his sermon by proclaiming a series of Beatitudes, or brief blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Matthew 5:3-12. When Jesus taught the crowds here, he had to deal with a flawed concept held by the Jewish people. They wanted a political leader who would lead them out of Roman occupation and oppression. They expected a Messiah who would show compassion to the Jews alone. They thought that being a child of Abraham was reason enough for the Messiah to accept them. But Jesus turned those concepts upside down. Instead of leading a rally to overthrow Rome, he called those who had been shown oppression blessed. Sounding still to the ears of many, he called on them to love their oppressors, love their rulers, and love those who curse them.
so, hold on, I'm going to stop share for a second. Can everybody hear that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. So I'm going to unmute everybody and I'm going to go to the teaching portion, then we'll get to some questions in a minute. So first I wanted to talk about an example that N.T. Wright gives. And he talks about how many years ago there was a dramatic movie about the first test pilots to break the sound barrier. No plane had ever flown faster than the speed of sound. Many people at that time didn't even believe it was possible. I think this was in the 40s. Some thought the plane would disintegrate under the forces that would be generated. Eventually in the movie, various pilots took their planes over the magic figure of 735 miles per hour, only to have the planes disintegrate with huge vibrations and to crash. The controls, it seemed, refused to work properly once the plane came up to that sound barrier. Finally, at the climax of the movie, another test pilot figured out what to do. It seemed that when the plane broke the sound barrier, the controls began to work backwards, pulling the stick to make the plane bring its nose up, sent it downward instead. Greatly daring, he flew to the same speed, and at the critical moment, instead of pulling the stick back, he pushed it forwards, and that would normally send the plane into a dive, but his hunch had been correct, and the nose came up, and the plane flew on fast and free, faster than anyone had ever traveled before. Now, this story in this movie is not historically accurate. Chuck Yeager is the one who first broke the sound barrier and he was the first human to move faster than the speed of sound in real life. He was often asked whether he had done it the way that was shown in this movie, but he insisted it wasn't like that. However, this movie story gives us a graphic illustration of what Jesus is doing in apparently simple words. He is taking the controls and making them work backwards. So the only explanation seems to be that he is taking God's people kind of through the sound barrier, taking them somewhere they'd never been before. And by the way, I was going to show you a video, but they were all too long, about Chuck Yeager, but his original plane, I think, is up in the Air and Space Museum over by Dulles, or it's the one in DC. Anyway, it's there. But they created a plane that was actually modeled after a bullet that they knew could travel faster than the speed of sound. So it's pretty neat piece of history there. But N.T. Wright says the one thing most people know about planes going through the sound barrier, of course, is you hear a loud explosion. And many of Jesus's contemporaries would have said that this was a good picture of the effect that Jesus has here. Jesus wasn't simply a great teacher. If we try to describe him like that, we will misunderstand him. The passage is the beginning of the famous Sermon on the Mount, which runs through chapters 5, 6, and 7 in Matthew's gospel, and sets out in Matthew's presentation of it the main themes of Jesus's proclamation. People often say what wonderful teaching the Sermon on the Mount is, and that if only people would obey it, the world would be a better place. But if we think of Jesus simply sitting there telling people how to behave properly, we will miss what's really going on here in this passage. These blessings, the wonderful news that he's announcing, are not saying try hard to live like this. They are saying the people who are already like that are in good shape. They should be happy and celebrate. Jesus is not suggesting that these are simply timeless truths about the way the world is and about human behavior. If he is saying that, he was wrong. Mourners often go uncomforted. The meek don't inherit the earth, and those who long for justice frequently take that longing to the grave. But this is an upside down world, or perhaps a right way up world, and Jesus is saying that with his work, it's starting to come true. This is an announcement, not a philosophical analysis of the world. It's about something that's starting to happen, not about a general truth of life. It's gospel, which of course means good news. It's not good advice. Follow me, Jesus said to the first disciples, because in him the living God was doing a new thing. And this list of wonderful news is part of his invitation, part of his summons, part of his way of saying that God is at work in a fresh way and that this is what it looks like. Jesus is beginning a new era for God's people in God's world. From here on, all the controls people thought they knew about are going to work the other way around. In our world still, most people think the wonderful news consists of success, wealth, long life, victory in battle. Jesus is offering wonderful news for the humble, the poor, the mourners, and the peacemakers. Now, the word wonderful news is often translated blessed, and being part of the point is that this is God's wonderful news. God is acting in and through Jesus to turn the world upside down, to turn Israel upside down, to pour out lavish blessings on all who now turn to him and accept the new things that he is doing. This list, by the way, is sometimes called the Beatitudes because the Latin word beatus means blessed. But the point is not to offer a list of what sort of people God normally blesses. The point is to announce God's new covenant. So I wanted to throw this up here again. You remember this from a couple weeks ago. Here is the first coming of Jesus, and this is this age and the age to come. And here's the second coming of Jesus. So what Jesus is saying is that since he has come, he has inaugurated this age to come, and we are living in this already but not yet time. The last days, which last a long time in the human kind of concept of time, but for God are quick. And these are the overlapping ages time. So he is bringing about the age to come. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So when going back to this age, we think about what we've already learned about Matthew. In Deuteronomy, the people came through the wilderness and arrived at the border of the promised land, and God gave them a solemn covenant. He listed the blessings and curses that would come upon them if they were obedient or disobedient, and that's Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you want to look that up. Now, Matthew has shown us Jesus coming out of Egypt through the water and the wilderness, if you look at chapters 3 and 4, and into the land of promise that we looked at last week. Remember, Jesus, for Matthew, is following the same trajectory that Israel followed. And here he now is at the Sermon on the Mount at the new covenant. This new age to come involves a new covenant. So when do these promises come true? There's a great temptation for Christians to answer in heaven or after death. And at first sight, if you look at verses 3, 10, and 11 in today's passage, that seem to say the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor in spirit and the persecuted. And there's a great reward in heaven for those who suffer persecution for Jesus' sake. This, though, is a misunderstanding of the meaning of heaven. Heaven is God's space where full reality exists, close by our ordinary earthly reality and interlocking with it. One day, heaven and earth will be joined together forever, and the true state of affairs, at present out of sight, will be unveiled. After all, verse 5 says that the meek will inherit the earth, and that can hardly happen in a disembodied heaven and earth. No, the clue comes in the next chapter in the prayer Jesus taught his followers. And we are going to pray that God's kingdom will come and that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The life of heaven, the life of the realm where God is already king, is to become the life of the world, transforming the present earth into the place of beauty and delight that God always intended. And those who follow Jesus are to begin to live by this rule here and now. That's the point of the Sermon on the Mount and these Beatitudes in particular. They are a summons to live in the present in the way that will make sense for God's future, right? So going back to this, we live here, but we live like this. This is darkness, and we want to live like the kingdom of light, which we'll talk about in a minute. So again, I'll say that again. There are summons to live in the present in a way that will make sense for God's future trajectory, because the future has arrived with the coming of Jesus. God's promised future is already here. We are supposed to be about bringing that age to come into existence. That's why we pray, again, let God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It may seem upside down, but we are called to believe with great daring that, in fact, this is the right way up. And N.T. Wright would like to say, try it and see. So kind of for our first question, I'll remind you that the first word of each verse in the Beatitudes just translated blessed, or you might have heard happy are they. That's another way to translate that, because the Latin word beatus, again, here means blessed. Now, Jesus is not suggesting that these are simply timeless truths about the way the world is. We already talked about how mourners often go uncomforted, and those who long for justice frequently take that longing to the grave, is what that's supposed to say. Jesus is saying that with his work, these things will start to come true. And this is an announcement of gospel, which means good news, not just good advice. So our question kind of for you guys, for the group, is what would be wonderful news for people in our society today? And what would be wonderful news for you? So you can unmute yourself and answer those questions if you're interested. What would be wonderful news for people in our society today? And what would be wonderful news for you? Anybody? Remember to unmute yourself or hit the space bar to talk. Nobody
a way out of the wilderness that we're currently in with the COVID-19 coronavirus.
For sure. That's the first thing that came to my mind, right? That would be some wonderful news that we came up with a vaccine or a cure. I mean, to me, I was kind of celebrating just hearing that drug had some good positive effects, the study in California. What other good news, wonderful news will be good for our society or for us?
Did you hear the name of the company that was doing that is called Gilead?
It is. It's Gilead.
And there's a balm.
Right. There's a balm in Gilead.
Hopefully.
Right. We hope.
That would be good news.
It would be very good news. Other thoughts?
I think good news would be return of civility among our people.
Right. Maybe not to be so polarized like we were talking about. Maybe have more reconciliation, more compromise, more listening, more peacemaking.
And I think out of this virus that I think that we really start to care more for the people, the least, the people who are poorer, more in need, and not be so focused on money and those kind of things. I think we're lacking in a lot of ways, and I think this virus has brought to light a lot of those inequities.
Right. Also for us to really cherish the things we probably took for granted, right? Being able to see our families, being able to gather together in corporate worship in person, being able to hug people, this has become the upside down year, right? A comedian friend of mine who's a Christian said she opened the door for somebody and apologized for doing it this year. That's opposite of what normally happens, right?
Yep.
Any other wonderful news?
And I think less emphasis on material goods, that what we can live with and what we need are certainly, we're readjusting those kinds of limits in our lives.
Right, for sure. So this was, we're not gonna have time to do this tonight, but to think through, this is, if you look at the emails I send out at the bottom, there are a list of questions. But what would be the opposite of each beatitude is something to think through. And then to answer, how are the beatitudes countercultural? So anybody want to answer that? How do you think they are countercultural? Or pick one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The Beatitudes, in conjunction with what you mentioned, that the Israelites were looking for a political leader. And we spend a lot of time, even in church, looking for the church to solve social problems, just like the Israelites were waiting for a Messiah to lead them against the Romans, because they said, well, the Messiah is going to defeat the enemies of Israel. And Christ's arrival was to make the point, the enemies of Israel are not the Romans. The Romans are going to go away. The Romans are of this world, and they will be gone. The enemies of Israel are the pride and the distance you put between yourself and God that you carry with you. Right. No one else does this. You do this to you.
Right.
And much like Israel in the wilderness, we have to get sort of reminded of this lesson every couple of years. But it's countercultural because our culture tells us, well, of course we have to be super excited and angry about politics. Of course, we have to be super excited and angry about a sports team, about being stuck at home. And all Christ is saying, almost as often and as loud as he can, is if you're thinking about things that are not centered under how to get into a relationship with me, who loves you unconditionally, you're missing the point and you're hurting yourself.
Right. And that's interesting too, is that we're going to talk about this in the next section of the passage about being salt and light. That's pretty much where the Beatitudes are leading, is this idea of you need to, Israel is not being the salt, the salt, we're jumping ahead here, was a preservative, right? It's what kept the world together, and that's what Israel was called to be, and it wasn't being that at that time. They weren't being the light in the darkness, and that can also apply to us. How can we look at ourselves and notice the place that we're not being salty and we're not being light? So that's kind of, again, this upside down, very countercultural message, this idea that the poor in spirit are going to inherit the kingdom of God, and the mourners and the meek. So it's all very, very countercultural. Anybody else? We're gonna keep moving along. As I wanted to show you this, I think there's time to do this. This is a song by Hillsong. Some of you like contemporary music, some of you don't, but I'm gonna actually make sure I have all of you guys muted, just so you guys can hear this well. But I just thought we would take a break between the two sections and listen to this song.
Blessed are the ones who mourn, for
All right. So I hope I'm going to stop it just to see. Can everybody hear that okay? All right, excellent. So make sure it's still working. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next section after that little musical interlude. So is anybody willing to read this next section, which N.T. Wright calls Fulfilling the Law? But most of you probably think of it as the Salt and Light passage. Somebody be willing to unmute themselves and read this for us?
I can read it if you like.
Thanks.
Unless somebody else did.
Go for it.
Fulfilling the law, salt and light. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt becomes tasteless, how is it going to get salty again? It's no good for anything. You might as well throw it out and walk all over it. You're the light of the world. A city can't be hidden if it's on top of a hill. People don't light a lamp and put it under a bucket. They put it on a lampstand. Then it gives light to everybody in the house. That's how you must shine your light in front of people. Then they will see what wonderful things you do, and they'll give glory to your Father in heaven. Don't suppose that I came to destroy the law or the prophet. Sorry, I think a little bit's missed there. I can't see. The prophets, something to destroy them. I came to fulfill them. I'm telling you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not one stroke, not one dot is going to disappear from the law until it's all come true. So anyone who relaxes a single one of these, sorry, it's going in and out. It's okay.
Sorry.
No problem. So anyone who relaxes a single one of these commandments, even the little ones, and teaches that to people will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Yes, let me tell you, unless your covenant behavior is far superior to that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven.
Thanks, Liz. Sorry about that. I was
No
trying to
problem.
make sure I could get the people's faces off the right corner for you, but anyway.
That's okay. No worries.
So that is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We all know what happens when a revolutionary party suddenly finds itself in power. It's one thing to shout angrily from the sidelines, but quite another to form a government and to run a country. All sorts of things have to be organized and dealt with when a rebel movement, which a rebel movement can happily ignore. When this happens, two questions are asked. First, can this movement really do the basic things that a government can do better than its predecessor? And was it just making a lot of noise, which now turns out to be hot air, or can it really deliver the goods? And then second, can it remain true to itself and its original ideals, even though it's now in power? Will it in turn become corrupt and just like all other governments, starting off in a blaze of glory and good intentions and ending up riddled with corruption and muddle? So Jesus was starting a revolution, all right, but it was a different sort of revolution from all the other ones that were kind of bubbling up in his days. And he had to do two things at the same time. First, he had to show the Jews of his day that this movement really was the fulfillment of all that Israel had believed and longed for. And second, he had to show that he and his followers were really living by and also dying by the new way he was announcing. The tension between these two sometimes seemed fierce, and to this day, many people misunderstand it. Some think of Jesus as just a great Jewish teacher without much of a revolution, and others see him so revolutionary that he left Judaism behind altogether and established something quite new. But this passage that we just read shows how Jesus himself held the two things together. He was indeed offering something utterly revolutionary to which he would remain faithful, but it was, in fact, the reality towards which Israel's whole life and tradition had pointed. This passage, following the striking introduction to the Sermon on the Mount in verses 3 through 12, the Beatitudes, introduces the main theme that will occupy Jesus in what follows. He has come to fulfill the law and the prophets. Most of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount explains exactly what that means, right through to chapter 7, verse 11, then 7, verse 12, echoing chapter 5, 17. It sums it all up. when you get to that really famous passage, do to others, he says, what you would like them to do to you, because that is what the law and the prophets are all really about. The sermon then concludes with sharp warnings about the urgent need to pay attention to what Jesus is saying, and that's in chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. So our present passage then is a kind of gateway to all that is coming that will follow it, and its theme is clear. Jesus is calling the Israel of his day to be Israel indeed, now that he is there. What he says here can now be applied to all Christians, but its original meaning was a challenge to Jesus' own contemporaries. God had called Israel to be the salt of the earth, but Israel was behaving like everybody else, with its power politics, its factional squabbles, its militant revolutions. How could God keep the world from going bad, which was the main function of salt in the ancient world, if Israel, his chosen salt, had lost its distinctive taste? In the same way, God called Israel to be the light of the world. Israel was the people through whom God intended to shine his bright light into the world's dark corners, not simply to show up evil, but to enable people who were blundering around in the dark to find their way. But what if the people called to be light bearers had become part of the darkness? That was Jesus's warning. Also his challenge. Jerusalem, the city set on a hill, was supposed to be a beacon of hope to the world. His followers were to be like that. Their deep, heartfelt keeping of God's laws would be a sign to the nations around that the one God, the Creator, the God of Israel, was God indeed, and that they should worship him. We can imagine people saying to themselves, well, here's another new teacher who thinks he's got the answer. We've already got teachers of the law. We've already got the Pharisees who think their interpretation is the proper one. What's different about this man? Jesus gives his answer straight from the shoulder. The scribes and the Pharisees do indeed teach a way of being faithful to God, a way of behaving in accordance with God's covenant. But God's own sovereign rule, the kingdom of heaven, is even now breaking in. And those who want to belong to the new world he is opening up must discover a way of covenant behavior that goes far, far beyond anything the scribes or Pharisees had ever dreamed of. So again, we're coming to the age to come. This is what Christ is coming. He's not throwing out the old law, but we have the new law coming here. Jesus wasn't abandoning the law and the prophets. Israel's whole story, commands, promises, and all, was going to come true in him. But now that he was here, a way was opening up for Israel, and through that, all the world, to make God's covenant a reality in their own selves. Changing behavior not just by teaching, but a change of heart and mind itself. This was truly revolutionary and at the same time deeply in tune with the ancient stories and promises of the Bible. And the remarkable thing is that Jesus brought it all into reality in his own person. He, Jesus, was the salt of the earth. He was the light of the world, set up on a hilltop, crucified for all the world to see, becoming a beacon of hope and new life for everybody, drawing people to worship his Father, embodying the way of self-giving love, which is the deepest fulfillment of the law and the prophets. That's why these sayings, originally applied to Israel, now apply to all those who follow Jesus and draw on his life as the source of their own. So, how does this challenge affect us today? And that's where we get our first question. Where does the world need salt and light right now? And how can we, through following Jesus, provide it? And you can unmute yourself and answer that question if you so desire. Where do you think the world needs salt and light, and how can we, through Jesus, for following him, provide it?
On earth.
On earth, right, just like it is in heaven. That's right, Marlo.
Yep.
Yep. By loving people and taking care of them, right? What are some ways we can be salt and light? Any other ideas? So I'll hold one up, right? Somebody made these. What are these? Masks, right? So making those for people who need them. That's an immediate way we can be salt and light in the world. Other thoughts?
We can make calls, we can write notes, we can send texts, just validate people and help them know that they're not by themselves.
Right.
And also feeding the hungry.
Right. It's a big need right now.
Many ways you can do that.
Right. And we feed them first, if we take care of their bodily needs, right? And then we can feed people spiritually as well, right? Both important. But we need to take care of those initial bodily needs first. Other ways we can be salt and light.
Your body.
Right. You guys are quiet tonight. All right.
In regards to climate change.
Say it again.
In regards to climate change,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot we can do.
Right.
And there's a lot by doing, others will follow us as well.
Right. So taking care of God's earth and reminding people that it's a gift and being good examples and then sharing ways that we're taking care of God's earth. I remember when I was living in Betsy's basement, she taught me about this kind of saran wrap that's like wax that you can reuse that her granddaughter had taught her, I think. Is that right, Betsy?
Yes.
Yes. See? And so I learned something new and I've shared that. So we're going to look at another passage that talks about light and darkness. So this again was what the prophet Isaiah is speaking to Israel here. So somebody unmute themselves and read Isaiah 42 verses 6 through 7.
I will do that.
Thanks, Betsy.
I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness.
The word of the Lord. Thanks
be to God.
So how does this passage help us understand what Jesus is getting at in Matthew 5:14 through 15? How can we connect the two? Any thoughts?
Red letters.
Go ahead.
With the red letters.
Right. That's one way we can do that, Marlo. We can be light that way. Richard, you were going to say something?
Yeah, the people of Christ are supposed to be an example.
Right.
And that's part of what Jesus is getting at there, and a big part of what Isaiah is getting at.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to the works of mercy and charity, just not living a privatized faith. And we don't have to be endlessly proselytizing to people, but not hiding our light. My grandparents' church, when I was a kid, our favorite Sunday school songs was "This Little Light of Mine."
Right.
And you have, one of the things that hit me just before I started coming back to church was the awareness that practically no one around me knew that I was a Christian. And that was a sign that something was really, really wrong.
Right. So it's a balance between, here I got my big HarperCollins study Bible here and bashing people with it and saying, you're not living right and you're going to burn in hell. That's proselytizing in a probably a way Jesus wouldn't want us to. But it's also the other end of the spectrum is not sharing your faith at all, never telling anyone about this good news, about this new kingdom that's coming about. So there's this balance there. So maybe it's saying, hey, during this hard time that in my life, what got me through it was my faith in God, and the church, surrounded me with love and care when this loved one passed away, or, is putting that out there for folks so that that's the way to be light is shining that the Christ's love and Christ's presence is a beacon of hope for us as individuals. And by sharing that good news and how Christ has been active in our lives, we can be light to the world. So that's kind of what you're getting at, Richard. Okay. Other thoughts?
And I think too that, since we're mainly communicating through Facebook, that whatever I post on Facebook, I try for it to reflect goodness and kindness rather than meanness and sarcasm and, that kind of thing. You can go down one road or another. And
right.
So that has to reflect who you are. You just can't put out that kind of stuff and then go to church and say, oh, here I am, I'm a godly woman.
Right. Well, you can, but it's not what God's calling us to do. Right. I always talk about.
Doesn't strike, right?
Right. So again, Facebook is a tool like a hammer. I've said this 6 million times. It's my favorite example. I can build a house, a habitat house for someone with a hammer, and I can also hit somebody with a hammer. And it's not the hammer's fault. It's how I'm using it. So it's a tool that can be used for, we'll use this, darkness or light. So we want to use our tools that God has given us, our gifts God has given us, technology and everything for God's light. And not saying we're going to get it right all the time, but it's a good reminder, very good reminder. So we're going to move on, just looking at the time. And the next question is, in what practical ways do Christians serve as salt and light in the world? So what kind of practical ways do you see that Christians can serve as salt and light? We've talked about some of these already. Mm-hmm. So everything from sharing on Facebook, uplifting positive encouragement, to building habitat houses, right? Collecting food, which is much needed for the Acts Food Pantry now, or donating to the Acts Food Pantry.
We should do that then.
Other thoughts?
I think using your talents, what are your talents and what do you have that you can give to people? During the first days of the stay at home kind of thing, somebody knocked at the door and it was Jess Martin. And she was going by 234 and she said, I just want to stop and see how you all are doing.
Right.
And I was just floored that, first of all, that she was out of the house.
Right.
Second of all, that she would stop by my house to see how I was doing. I thought that was just lovely. Right. So we can surprise each other like that in ways that means so much, Right.
And she's the one who sewed those face masks that I just held up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So sewing is her gift, not my gift.
Right.
But we all have gifts we've been given, I always use the example of my friend who's really good at soccer. Well, he started, he went over to Africa, and that's an extreme example, but started a soccer program for boys who didn't have fathers. Mm-hmm. There's a way for, even video games can be used for God's glory. All right. So how is Jesus himself the fulfillment of Matthew 5:13 through 20? So, So again, going back so you guys remember what Matthew 5:13 through 20 was. Sorry for the quick. 13 is you are the salt of the earth, and light. We kind of answered that. N.T. Wright did, but basically, who is the light of the world? Jesus, right? Jesus is the salt, right? And the city on the hill is Jerusalem, but Jerusalem means city of peace, and of course, Jesus is ruler, right? So that's kind of how Jesus himself is a fulfillment of what he's talking about. But we're called to take that message and spread it. So that was kind of the end. We have 5 more minutes left, and me, I'm going to stop the share real quick because I'm going to mute all of you guys again so that hopefully nobody will go over this. I love Broadway. I have 2 things to share with you. The first, though, is my favorite song from the new Broadway recording of Godspell, which I think came out in 2011, which sounds really like a long time ago, but really wasn't. So Godspell, by the way, was a play about Jesus written by Stephen Schwartz. If you know a lot about musicals, he's the same guy who wrote Wicked. But I wanted to share this with you. And so this is the song that goes right with the passage that we just studied tonight. So hope you enjoy this as much as I do. And you'll see some very famous people if you watch TV shows. This is the original cast, again, of God's. That's why it says...
bushel, it's lost something kind of crucial. You gotta stay blind to be the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. But if that salt has lost its flavor, it ain't got much in its favor. You can't have that fault and be the salt of the earth. So let your light so shine before men. Let your light so shine, so that they might know some kindness again. We all need help to feel fine. Let's have some wine. Woo! You are the city of God. You are the city of God. But if that city's on a hill, it's kind of hard to hide it well. You gotta stay pretty in the city of God. So let your light so shine. Let your light so shine, so that they might know some kindness again. We all need help to feed us, have some wine. You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. Boy, the tallest candlestick ain't much good without a wick. You gotta live right. You gotta live right. To be the light of the world.
Well, it's different. I think it's really cool. We have amazing voices. We're, really excited to be doing the new cast album with these amazing arrangements and these fantastic voices.
Oops. Didn't mean to. Anyway, had anybody heard that before? Couple people, yeah.
You know what, Adam?
Mhm.
We saw Godspell in London on our honeymoon in 1974.
Wow. So again, this new version's very different than that original version, but this is kind of a reimagined version of Godspell. So I think they were all like almost like clowns in the 70s. There's a 70s movie version too, but this is one of my favorite songs from Godspell, and anyway, it brings me joy.
Yeah.
So.
There was no video with it. We just heard the sound.
Oh, sorry, it didn't work. Well,
That's okay.
the video is really just them recording. It's just in a recording studio anyway. So, but if you go to YouTube and type in Light of the World, new Broadway cast, it will pop up and you can see the video portion. There was no video of them in the theater doing it. I wanted to end before we. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer, and then I'll end with a song called "Salt and Light" by Lauren Dangle, which is she's a new contemporary Christian artist. If you probably heard a lot of her stuff, but maybe you haven't, and if you need to go while that's going on, I understand. It's just a lyric video too. So let's first close in prayer. Let us pray. Almighty and loving God, we just thank you for this gift of gathering around your word tonight, studying your Beatitudes, and realizing that you have sent Jesus to turn the world upside down, and that it's our calling, our job to be a part of that movement, of that revolution to kind of right the world, really. So we ask you to help us to be the salt and light of the world, to be a city on a hill, shining light wherever we go, whether that's sharing our own personal testimony and witness of the ways Christ has been active in our lives, or doing the social justice work of feeding the hungry, taking care of the earth, sewing masks, making phone calls, writing notes and letters, being encouraging on social media. However we can serve you, help us to do that in the days and weeks and months ahead. It is in your precious Son's name we pray. Amen. So we're going to end. I'm going to share the screen. Again, I know I'm trying to be conscious of your time, but I'm sorry you guys didn't see the video. Hopefully you'll be able to see this video. Thanks for that. But here is a closing song by Lauren. I might be saying her last name wrong, but Salt and Light. All right. Could you see the video that time? Yeah. Okay. It's probably something I did. I'm still learning all this technology too. So anyway, that's just another a new song by her, or I don't know if that's a new one, but anyway, I don't know. Any thoughts about the music I shared? I'm sorry you couldn't see the other video of Godspell. But the other reason I like that song by Lauren Engel is it talks about Jesus being the salt and light, right? Other thoughts?
I just want to pray that Debbie is not in England because she's on the driving side of the car if she's in England.
I am not. I'm driving back to Smith Mountain Lake. My husband is driving.
Right. I'm going to stop.
Sorry if the background is making you seasick.